You want to know the strangest thing I ever saw? It wasn't a star going dark. It wasn't a ship the size of a city folding itself in half to slip through a gap in space. I've seen both of those, and worse. No. The strangest thing I ever saw was a tired human man kneel down in the mud of a dying world and put his bare hands on a child who was already gone. And then she wasn't gone anymore. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started. My name doesn't matter much. People called me Vel back then. I worked the supply runs out past the Carabelt, the part of the galaxy nobody talks about at dinner parties. It's the edge. The frontier, if you want to be romantic about it. The dump, if you want to be honest. It's where the maps get blurry and the law gets thin and everybody out there is either running from something or hunting it. I'm not human, by the way. I should say that now so you understand the way I'm telling this. I'm Thren. My people have gray skin and 4 eyes and we live a long time and we don't get attached to things easily. That last part matters. I want you to remember it. We don't get attached. So when I tell you that I still think about that night, almost 40 years later, you'll understand it took something rare to crack me open like that. The station was called Outpost 9. Don't bother looking for it now. It's gone. But back then it was a real place. A fat, ugly ring of metal hanging in orbit around a planet called Surith, which the locals called something prettier that I could never pronounce right with my throat. Surith was a war world, not in the dramatic sense with banners and trumpets. It was a slow war, the kind that grinds. 2 factions had been fighting over the planet's mineral cores for longer than anyone could remember why, and the people who actually lived there, the Surith-born, they just got crushed in between. Refugees, always more refugees. They'd come up to Outpost 9 in rattling little shuttles, half of them held together with tape and prayer, looking for passage out, looking for medicine, looking for someone to just notice they were still alive. Most of the galaxy didn't notice. Most of the galaxy had decided Surith wasn't worth the fuel cost. I ran supplies in and out. Water filters, ration packs, busted parts for busted machines. I wasn't a good man exactly. I wasn't a bad one either. I took the jobs that paid and I kept my head down and I did not get attached. 4 eyes are useful for not getting attached. You can watch a lot of things at once and care about none of them. The weather on the station was always the same, which is to say there wasn't any, just the recycled air that smelled faintly of metal and somebody's cooking 3 corridors over. But you could see Surith's weather through the big viewport on the docking ring. Storms the color of old bruises rolling across the southern continent. Lightning that lasted a full second and lit up the whole sky like something underneath was trying to claw its way out. I used to stand at that viewport and watch the storms. I told myself it was beautiful. I think really I was just glad I wasn't down there in it. That's where I met him, at the viewport. He came in on a medical transport, one of those non-profit ships crewed by people too stubborn to admit the galaxy had given up. The ship was called the Mercy Errant, which I always thought was a strange name. Mercy that wanders, mercy that makes mistakes, maybe both. Their captain was a tall, bird-boned woman from some core world, and her crew was a patchwork of species, and among them was the human. You have to understand, humans were still kind of a novelty out on the edge in those days. They'd only been out among the stars for, 150 of their years, a blink. Most of the galaxy thought of them as the new kids, loud, soft, short-lived, sentimental, always crying or laughing or fighting about things that didn't matter. The old species, the ones who'd been starfaring for 10,000 years, they looked at humans the way you look at a puppy that's gotten into the trash, exasperated. A little charmed, not really taking it seriously. His name was Daniel Okafor. He told me to call him Dan. He had dark skin and gray starting at his temples and a way of standing very still when he listened to you, like whatever you were saying was the only thing happening in the universe right then. That was unusual. Most people, when you talk to them, you can see them waiting for their turn to speak. Not him. He just listened. He was a medic, not a doctor exactly. He was quick to correct me on that. Doctors went to school, he said. I went to war. He'd been a combat medic for the human military for a long time, then he'd gotten old enough or tired enough to leave it, and instead of going home and sitting in a chair like a sensible person, he'd signed onto the Mercy Errant to keep doing the thing he knew how to do, pull people back from the edge. I asked him once why he kept doing it. We were at the viewport, both of us watching a bruise-colored storm chew up the southern continent. He thought about it for a while. Humans do that, take their time before answering the real questions. Because I'm good at it, he finally said. And being good at something and not doing it, that's a kind of waste I can't stomach. There are easier places to be good at it, I said. There are, he didn't look away from the storm, but they don't need me there. I didn't understand that then. I thought it was sentiment. I thought it was the soft human thing, the puppy in the trash thing. I filed it away as something to be mildly amused by. I'm telling you now, I was wrong about almost everything I thought about him. The thing you have to understand about that part of the galaxy is the coalition wasn't really the law out there. Officially it was. The Stellar Coalition governed everything from the core out to the Carabelt, and Outpost 9 flew their flag, and their soldiers walked the corridors. But the coalition didn't care about Surith. Surith wasn't profitable. Surith was a problem they wished would solve itself. So the soldiers who got posted to Outpost 9 weren't the coalition's best. They were the ones being punished, or the ones who'd volunteered for the hardship pay, or the ones who'd done something they needed to disappear from. Galactic soldiers. The Vorth mostly. Big armored people, 2.5 meters tall with a chitin plate over their skin like living armor, and a culture that valued discipline above almost everything else. Strong as anything, disciplined as anything, and out at Outpost 9 bored. Bored and bitter and far from home. That's a bad combination in any species. The commander of the coalition garrison was a Vorth named Submarshal Korath. I remember him very clearly. He had a scar across 2 of his eye ridges, and he walked with the kind of slow certainty that big, strong people have when they've never once in their lives lost a fight. He ran the station the way you'd run a prison. Curfews. Searches. He decided which refugee ships got to dock and which ones got turned away to drift back down into the storms. He turned away a lot of them. The Mercy Errant fought him on that constantly. The bird-boned captain would stand in his office, all 5 feet of her against all 8 feet of him, and argue about docking permissions and medical access until she was hoarse. Sometimes she won. Mostly she didn't. Korath had a way of letting you talk yourself empty and then saying no anyway, like your words were just whether he was waiting out. Dan didn't argue with Korath. He just worked. While the captain fought the political war up top, Dan was down in the refugee holding bays in the cold, echoing cargo levels where they crammed the Surithborn who'd made it up but had nowhere to go. He patched them up with whatever he had, and by the time I knew him, he didn't have much. The Mercy Errant was always running low. Always. I started carrying supplies for them. Off the books. I'd skim a little off my legitimate cargo, a few crates of saline, some bandage foam, painkillers, and I'd route it down to the holding bays for Dan. I told myself it was because it was easy money, the nonprofit paid in fuel credits. But the nonprofit barely paid at all. The truth is I started doing it because of the way Dan said thank you. He'd take the crate, and he'd look at me with those steady human eyes, and he'd say, "Thank you," like he meant it all the way down. Like I'd done something that mattered. And I, who do not get attached, who have 4 eyes precisely so I never have to look at any one thing too long, I found myself wanting to hear him say it again. That's how it gets you, not all at once, a crate at a time. There was a girl. There's always a girl, or a boy, or a child in these stories, isn't there? Some small life that becomes the hinge the whole thing turns on. I used to think that was a cheap trick that storytellers used. Now I know it's just true. The small lives are the hinges. They always were. We just don't look at them until something forces us to. Her name was Ian. She was Surithborn, maybe 8 of their years old, which is hard to map onto a human age, but think of a child who's lost her front teeth and gained a mouth full of opinions. The Surithborn are slight people, with skin that shimmers faintly blue-green like the inside of a shell, and big dark eyes with no whites to them, and a soft humming way of talking that goes right into your chest. Ian had come up to the station on one of the rattling shuttles. Her parents hadn't made it. I never learned exactly what happened to them. On Surith, the ways to die were too numerous to track. She'd come up alone, this tiny blue-green child clutching a wrapped bundle of someone's belongings, and she'd ended up in the holding bays, and Dan had ended up looking after her. Not officially. There was no official anything for orphans on Outpost 9, but Dan had taken to her and she to him, and you'd see them together in the cargo levels, this big tired human and this tiny shimmering child, and he'd be teaching her things. Human card games, the names of constellations, how to whistle, which she could not do because her mouth was the wrong shape, but she tried, and the trying made him laugh. I'd bring my crates down and they'd be there, the two of them, in the cold blue light of the holding bay, and for a few minutes the whole grinding, hopeless place would feel almost warm. She called him Dan. She couldn't quite get the single syllable to land, so she doubled it. He never corrected her. I asked him about it once, whether it was wise, getting that close to one child when there were 1,000 and you couldn't save them all. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I've never forgotten. "You can't save everyone," he said, "but that's not a reason to save no one. You save the one in front of you, and then the next one in front of you. That's the whole job. People think it's complicated. It's not. It's just heavy. You save the one in front of you. I've repeated that to myself 1,000 times since. I'll repeat it to you for free. Now I have to tell you about the night, and I want to tell it right, because what happened is the thing you came here to hear, and I've never told it properly to anyone. It started with a sickness in the holding bays. Surith had a lot of diseases. The war had stirred up things from deep in the mineral cores, old microbes that didn't belong on the surface, and the refugees brought them up to the station in their lungs and their blood. Most of the time it was manageable. Dan and the Mercy Errant crew could keep it contained. But this one was different. It moved fast. It came on like a fever, and then it went into the blood, and the blood went wrong, started clotting where it shouldn't and thinning where it should clot, and within a day a healthy person was hemorrhaging from the inside. The Surithborn are slight to begin with. They didn't have much to lose. It tore through the holding bays. Within a few days, 1/4 of the refugees were sick. Dan worked without sleeping. I'd come down with my crates and find him gray-faced and swaying on his feet, moving from cot to cot, and the bird-boned captain up top screaming herself raw at Korath for medical supplies, for a quarantine zone, for anything. Korath gave them nothing. I was in his office once when the captain made her case. I'd been called up to answer questions about my cargo manifests, some nonsense about an unaccounted crate, and I was standing in the corner trying to be invisible while the captain begged. She told Korath people were dying. She told him it would spread to the station population if he didn't help contain it. She told him the coalition's own regulations required medical aid to refugees in a declared crisis. Korath listened to all of it with his big scarred face perfectly still, and when she ran out of words, he said, "The refugees are not coalition citizens. The regulations do not apply to them, and if the sickness reaches the station, I will solve that problem by venting the holding bays to vacuum." He said it the way you'd talk about taking out the trash. The captain went white. I went still in my corner, and Korath looked at her, this enormous armored soldier looking down at this small bird-boned woman, and he said, "You have my permission to leave." She left. I left right behind her, and in the corridor outside she stopped, and she put one thin hand against the wall, and she stood there shaking, not crying. Vorth respected strength, and she'd learned to never let them see her break, but shaking all the way through like a wire pulled too tight. I didn't know what to say. I'm not good at that. I have 4 eyes, and none of them are good at watching someone come apart. So I said the only useful thing I had. I have more supplies, off the books. I can get them down to Dan tonight. She looked at me and she said it won't be enough. And she was right. We both knew she was right, but she said bring them anyway. So I did. That night the holding bays were the closest thing to a battlefield I've ever seen that didn't have any guns in it. The cold blue cargo level was full of the dying. The humming way the Surith-born talk had turned into a low chorus of pain, dozens of voices all making the same soft broken sound, and it filled the space and got into your bones. Dan was in the middle of it, moving, always moving, his hands red to the wrist, his eyes hollowed out. 2 other crew from the Mercy Errant worked alongside him, but they were flagging, and you could see it. You could see them starting to do the math that everyone in a losing fight eventually does. The math of who you give up on. Dan wasn't doing that math. I watched him for an hour and he never once did that math. He just went to the one in front of him and then the next one in front of him. I brought the crates down on a grav sled. Saline, foam, the painkillers, some clotting agents I'd had to steal from a real ugly customer to get. Dan saw me, and for a second his whole face changed, this flood of relief, like I'd brought salvation. I'd brought a few crates. It wasn't going to be enough. We both knew it wasn't going to be enough. But you saved the one in front of you, so we got to work. I'm not a medic. I held things. I held bowls and bags in the hands of people I couldn't understand, 4-fingered shimmering hands that gripped mine with the awful strength of the dying. I'd never done anything like it. My people don't do that. We don't get attached. But that night I held the hands of strangers while they shook apart and I did not let go, and something in me that had been closed for a long time started, very painfully, to open. And then, near the worst hour of the night, the hour when the station lights dim for the sleep cycle and the whole place feels like the inside of a tomb, In got sick. I saw it happen. I was right there. She'd been helping. Of course she had. This tiny 8-year-old, going from cot to cot with a water bottle, doing the small kind things a child does when the adults are too overwhelmed to stop her. Dan kept trying to send her away to the clean section to safety. She kept coming back. He didn't have the time to fight her on it. And then she just sat down, in the middle of the floor, sat down like her strings had been cut, and she made a small sound and put her hand to her head, and when she took the hand away there was a thread of dark blood coming from her nose. I will never forget the sound Dan made. It wasn't a word. It was just a sound low like something tearing. He was across the room and then he was beside her, faster than I'd ever seen him move, and he had her in his arms and he was talking to her, low and steady. Hey, In, look at me. Stay with me, little one, look at me. She looked at him, those big dark eyes, no whites finding his face, and she said in that humming little voice, Dan, my head hurts. I know, he said. I know it does. I'm going to fix it, okay? I'm going to fix it, just stay with me. And he started to work. I have to tell you what the next part was like, because the title of this story promises you a thing, the glowing hands, the wound that vanished, and I'm going to get there, I promise. But you need to understand what came first, because what came first is the part that proves it. He did everything right, everything a medic could do. He'd seen this sickness now for days. He knew its pattern. He knew the clotting agents bought a little time. He knew the foam could hold pressure. He knew the saline could keep the blood pressure up. He did all of it. Fast and sure and perfect, the way a man does a thing he's done 10,000 times. His hands didn't shake. His voice didn't break. He worked on that child like she was the only patient in the universe. And it wasn't enough. The sickness was too far into her. It had moved too fast in her small body. The blood that should have clotted wouldn't, and the blood that shouldn't clot did, and there's a point past which a medic, even a great one, even the best one in the whole grinding galaxy, can't pull you back. He'd told me about that point once. The line, he'd called it. The line you can't cross to reach them. Ian went past the line. I watched it happen. I watched her eyes start to drift. I watched her humming voice go faint and then go quiet. I watched Dan's hands keep working, and I watched his face start to break apart, because he knew before I did. He had 10,000 patients of experience telling him what was happening, and the thing about being that good is you can't lie to yourself. She went still. The cold blue cargo level seemed to go silent, though it wasn't, though all around us people were still dying, still humming their low, broken chorus. But in the little circle of light around Dan and the child, everything went still. "No," Dan said, "just that, no." He started compressions. The human way, both hands on the small chest, counting under his breath. He breathed for her, his mouth over her small one. He did it again. And again. And one of the Mercy errant crew, the medic who'd been working beside him, came over and put a hand on his shoulder and said his name, said, "Dan, Dan, she's gone. She's been gone." And Dan said, "No," again, and kept going. I want you to understand. There was nothing left to do. I'm not a medic, but even I could see it. The child was gone. She'd crossed the line. Every law of biology, every rule that governed flesh and blood and the slow machinery of living things, every one of those laws had spoken, and they had said, "This child is dead." Dan knelt over her body in the cold blue light, and he was a man who'd spent his whole life learning all the things you could do, and he had reached the end of them. He had reached the place where there was nothing left to do. And that's when his hands began to glow. I need to stop here and be honest with you about something. For 40 years I've told myself I imagined the first part of it, the faint part, because what I saw didn't make sense, and my people don't believe in things that don't make sense, and it was the worst hour of the worst night, and I was exhausted and grief-sick, and maybe I saw what I needed to see. But I had 4 eyes on it, 4 eyes all watching the same thing, and I'll tell you what all 4 of them saw. It started in his palms, a light, not bright at first, just a warmth, a glow under the skin, like there was something burning low inside his hands. It was gold, a deep, warm gold, the color of a sun you'd actually want to stand under, not the cold blue of that terrible room. I thought it was a tool at first. Some human medical device I didn't know about, something in his sleeves. Humans were always inventing things, weren't they, the new kids, always tinkering. I thought, he's got some machine, some last resort thing. But there was no machine. His sleeves were pushed up past the elbow, his hands were bare, and the light was coming from inside them. He had them on her chest, both hands flat over her small, still heart. And the medic who told him she was gone, that medic had gone very quiet and had taken her hand off Dan's shoulder and was staring at his hands with her mouth open. The glow got brighter. And here is the thing I have struggled to describe for 40 years, the thing I've never found the right words for, and I'm a Thren, we have a lot of words. The light didn't just shine, it moved. It went from his hands into her. You could see it. It flowed down through his palms and into her chest, and it spread out under her shimmering blue-green skin, this warm gold light moving along the lines of her, into her neck, up into her head where the blood had come from, down into her small limbs, lighting her up from the inside like a lamp. And where the light went, things changed. I was holding the hand of a stranger across the room, an old Surith man who was himself dying, and even he turned his head to look. Even he in his last hours turned to look at the light, and I felt his grip change. I felt something move through him too, though that might have been my imagination, I'll never know. The blood at Ian's nose stopped. Then I don't know how to say this, it went back. The dark thread of it withdrew. Her skin, which had gone gray-blue with death, flushed back to that shimmering shell color of the living. And her chest, which had been still for minutes now, long past the line, long past every line. Her chest rose. She took a breath. I have heard 1,000 stories in my long life. I've heard tales of miracles and tales of monsters, and I've believed almost none of them because I am Thren and we are not a believing people. But I was there. I was in the room. I had 4 eyes on it, and all 4 of them saw a dead child breathe. Dan didn't stop. The light kept flowing, gold and warm, and Ian's small body kept changing under it, kept knitting back together, kept choosing life over death the way nothing dead is supposed to be able to choose. And Dan's face, I looked at his face, and it was not the face of a man performing a miracle. It was the face of a man in agony. Sweat was pouring off him. His jaw was clenched so hard I thought his teeth would crack. Whatever this was, this light, this thing he was doing, it was costing him. It was pouring out of him and into her, and it was emptying him to do it. The medic beside him found her voice. "Dan," she whispered. "Dan, how are you?" He didn't answer. I don't think he could. Every part of him was bent to the one task, the one child, the one life in front of him, and there was nothing left over for words. Ian's eyes opened. Those big dark eyes, no whites to them, opened in the gold light and found his face, the way they always did, the way they had 100 times across 100 card games. And in that small humming voice, weak but alive, she said, Dan, you're glowing." And he laughed. He laughed, this broken, exhausted sound with tears running down his face, and he said, yeah, I guess I am." The light began to fade. I wish I could tell you that was the end of the hard part, that the miracle happened and everyone was saved and the morning came clean and bright. But that's not how it went, and I promised you I'd tell it right. Because someone had seen. There was a surveillance node in the holding bay. There was a surveillance node in every part of Outpost 9. Korath ran the place like a prison, remember, and prisons have eyes everywhere. And that gold light, that impossible light, it had been bright enough to trip every sensor in the cold blue room. By the time Ian's eyes opened, by the time Dan laughed his broken laugh, the alarms were already going somewhere up above us, in a room with a big scarred Vorth in it, and that Vorth was already getting up from his chair. Dan slumped. The light gone now, the last of it draining out of him, and he slumped sideways and the medic caught him. And Ian, alive, impossibly alive, sat up and grabbed his arm with her small 4-fingered hands and said, Dan, in a rising, frightened voice, because the man who just pulled her back from death was now gray and shaking and barely conscious on the floor. I came across the room. I don't remember deciding to. One moment I was holding the hand of a stranger, and the next I was on my knees beside Dan, my 4 eyes all on his face, and I was saying his name too. "What was that?" I said. "Dan, what did you do?" He looked at me. He was so tired. I have never seen a living thing that tired. "I don't know," he said. "I never know, it just when there's nothing left, when I get to the end of everything I can do. Sometimes, not always, sometimes there's one more thing." He swallowed. "I don't understand it either, Vel. I've stopped trying to." "How long?" I said. "How long have you?" "Since the war," he said. "First time I thought I'd lost my mind. A boy, 18. He was gone, I'd called it, and then my hands, and then he wasn't gone." He closed his eyes. "I never told anyone. They'd have taken me apart to find out how. You understand, they'd have taken me apart." I understood. I understood it completely. Out here on the edge, a human who could do that, there were 100 powers in the galaxy who would have killed each other for the chance to cut him open and learn his secret. The coalition, the corporations, the warlords, everyone. And right now, the alarms were ringing. And Korath was coming. I want to leave you here for a moment, on the floor of that cold blue room, in the last fading gold of an impossible light, with a child breathing who should not be breathing and an exhausted man who's just given away a piece of himself to make it so. Because what comes next is the part where the soldiers arrive. The part where the big, disciplined galactic army comes down the corridor to take what they've seen. The part where one tired human has to stand between them and the people he saved. I've told you the strangest thing I ever saw, the glowing hands, the wound that vanished. But it wasn't the bravest thing. The bravest thing came next. Stay with me, I'll tell you the rest. I left you on the floor of the cold blue room, the light gone, the child breathing, The alarms ringing somewhere up above us. Let me pick it back up there because the next hour was the longest hour of my life, and I've had a very long life. We had maybe 4 minutes before the soldiers came. Maybe less. I knew the layout of that station better than almost anyone. I'd been running cargo through it for years, and I knew how long it took to get from Koreth's office down to the holding bays. 4 minutes if he walked, 2 if he ran. Koreth did not run. I'll tell you that now. He never ran. That was part of what made him so frightening. A man who is certain of himself never has to hurry. Dan was barely conscious. Whatever that light had cost him, it had nearly emptied him out. He could talk but he couldn't stand. The medic from the Mercy Errant, her name was Soa, I learned later. A quiet rust-colored woman from a world I'd never heard of. Soa had her arm under him, holding him up against a supply crate, and she was looking at me with an expression I knew well. The expression of someone who has just seen the rules of the universe broken and does not have time to think about it, because something worse is coming. And Ian was alive, sitting up shaky, her shimmering skin flushed back to the color of the living, her big dark eyes going between Dan and me and the door, understanding in the way children understand, which is to say not the details but the danger. She'd grabbed Dan's hand and she would not let go. "Vel," Soa said, "they're going to take him." "I know," I said. "You saw what he did. You saw it. If they take him." "I know what they'll do," I said, and I did. I'd done the math the moment the alarm started. A human who could pull the dead back from past the line. The coalition would not let that walk free. They'd take him to some quiet station in the Corps and they'd study him for the rest of his life, which under their care would probably not be very long. They'd take him apart to find out how the light worked. He'd told me that himself, lying on the floor. They'd have taken me apart. And here's the thing I want you to sit with. In that moment I was already thinking about how to get myself clear of it. 4 eyes, remember, always watching the exits. I am Thren, and we do not get attached, and the smart move, the safe move, the move my whole life had trained me to make, was to be somewhere else when the soldiers arrived. To have never been in this room. To have delivered my crates and gone like always. I want you to know I thought about it. I want to be honest with you. I stood there for a half a second and the old cold part of me said go, and I almost listened. And then Ian looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with those eyes that had no whites, holding the hand of the man who died a little to bring her back, and the cold part of me went quiet. It just went quiet. For the first time in my life, all 4 of my eyes were looking at one thing and they did not want to look away. "Get her up," I told Soa. "Get her into the crowd. There are 300 sick refugees in this bay. Koreth's people don't know which one she is. Hide her in the middle of them." Soa moved fast. She passed Dan's weight to me. He was heavier than he looked, dense the way humans are, and she scooped Ian up and carried her into the press of cots and bodies, into the chorus of the dying, and within seconds the child was gone, just one more small shape in a sea of small shapes. That left me holding Dan when the door opened. Koreth came in like weather. That's the only way I can describe it. The big doors hissed and there he was, 2.5 meters of armored Vorth, the scar across his eye ridges catching the cold blue light, and behind him 8 soldiers in full kit, plasma carbines up and ready. 8. For one room of dying refugees. That tells you something about how Koreth thought. He stopped just inside the door and his eyes swept the bay. He had a soldier's eyes. He was reading the room, counting, looking for the source of the light his sensors had screamed about. And then those eyes found me. A Thren cargo runner on his knees on the floor, holding up a half-conscious human. "You," Koreth said. His voice was a low grinding thing like rocks shifting. "Cargo runner, you are not crew. You are not authorized to be on this level." "I bring supplies," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I felt. "Medical supplies. People are dying down here, Sub-Marshal." "People are always dying down here," he said, and he came forward slow, certain, his soldiers fanning out behind him. My sensors registered an energy discharge in this bay, unregistered, powerful. He stopped in front of me and looked down, all that height, all that armor. Explain it. I looked up at him and I lied. I lied the way I'd lied 1,000 times to 1,000 customs officers, smooth and easy. A power cell ruptured. One of my crates, faulty seal, it flashed and burned out. I nodded at a crate near Dan, one I'd brought down myself. That one, you can check it, it's slag inside. It was too. I'd had a faulty cell in that crate for a week and never gotten around to dumping it. I'd been counting on that. A small lie needs a true thing to lean on. Korath looked at the crate, then back at me, and I watched his eyes and I knew, the way you know with a smart predator, that he did not believe me, not for a second. A power cell, he said. A power cell. And the human, he nudged Dan with the toe of his armored boot, not hard, just enough. Why is the medic on the floor? Exhaustion, I said. He's been working 4 days without sleep. He collapsed, I caught him. All true, all of it true. The best lies are mostly true. Korath was quiet for a moment. The whole bay was quiet except for the low chorus of the sick. 8 soldiers, carbines up. 1 Thren, 1 half-dead human, 300 dying refugees, and somewhere in the middle of them a small blue-green child who should have been a corpse. And then Dan spoke. I felt it before I heard it. His weight shifted against me. He was pushing himself up. I tried to hold him down, stay down, you fool, stay invisible, but he had decided, and there is nothing in the galaxy as immovable as a human who has decided. He got his feet under him. He stood, swaying, gray-faced, drenched in sweat, barely able to keep his eyes open, and he stood up to his full height, which was a head and a half shorter than Korath, and he looked the sub-marshal in the eye. It wasn't a power cell, Dan said. The whole room went cold. Dan, I said, don't. It was me, he said. He was looking at Korath and only at Korath. Your sensors are good. There was a discharge, it came from me. A child was dying and I did a thing I can do. I saved her. That's what your sensors saw. I closed all 4 of my eyes. I thought, you stupid, brave, soft, magnificent fool, I thought we had it. We had the lie. He believed it enough to walk away and you gave it back to him. Korath's whole posture changed, slowly, like a machine recalibrating. The boredom went out of him and something else came into him, something hungry and awake. He'd come down here expecting a malfunction, a faulty crate, a nothing. And instead he'd found the one thing in the entire grinding galaxy that could change his fortunes. A thing you can do, Korath repeated softly. Yes. Show me. No, Dan said. The soldiers shifted. Carbines came up another inch. And Korath smiled, which on a Vorth is a terrible thing to see, a slow pulling back of the chitin around the mouth. Medic, he said, do you understand what you are? Do you understand what the coalition will pay for what you are? A human who can heal past death. The labs in the core will weep with joy. I will be promoted off this rock for the rest of my life. You have just made me a wealthy and important person and you don't even know it. He gestured, and 2 soldiers moved forward to take Dan's arms. You will come with me. And Dan, exhausted, emptied, barely standing, Dan laughed. It wasn't a brave laugh. It was a tired one. The laugh of a man who has been here before in some form, on some other terrible night, and knows exactly how it goes. No, he said again, I won't. I need to tell you about the next part very carefully, because it's the part that mattered, and it's the part nobody believes when I tell it, and it's the part that's true. The soldiers reached for Dan, and Dan, who could barely stand, who had nothing left in his body, did not fight them. He didn't have the strength to fight them. Instead he turned, slowly, deliberately, with 2 armored soldiers gripping his arms, he turned and he looked out at the room. At the 300 dying refugees. At the cots and the bodies and the low humming chorus of pain. And he said, loud enough for the whole bay to hear, you all heard him, you heard the sub-marshal. He's going to take me away to the core to make himself rich. He had to stop and breathe. It cost him. And when I'm gone, who patches you up? Who brings the medicine? Him? He nodded at Korath. The man who said he'd vent this bay to vacuum if you got too sick. A ripple went through the room. The humming changed. Heads turned. 300 dying people who had nothing, who had lost everything, who had been treated as a problem to be solved and trash to be taken out. 300 dying people turned and looked at the soldiers. He told your captain, Dan went on, his voice getting rougher, that you aren't citizens, that the rules don't apply to you, that he'd kill you all if it was convenient. He looked at Korath now. Isn't that right, Sub-Marshal? Say it again. Say it to their faces. Korath's smile was gone. Silence him, he said. A soldier raised a hand to do it, and then stopped. Because the room was moving. I have seen battles, real ones with ships and guns, but I have never seen anything like what happened in that cold blue holding bay, because there were no guns on our side. There were no soldiers on our side. There were 300 sick, dying, slight blue-green people who weighed nothing, who had nothing, who could barely stand, and they stood. The old Surith man whose hand I'd held, the one who was himself dying, he got up off his cot. It took him 3 tries, and he stood. And then the one next to him stood. And then a mother holding a sick child stood, and then a young one barely older than Ian, and then more and more, the whole room rising up off its cots and its blankets and its patches of cold floor, 300 people getting to their feet in the blue light. They didn't charge, they couldn't have. Half of them couldn't have crossed the room without falling. They just stood, and then they moved slowly, painfully, putting their slight bodies between the soldiers and Dan, one step at a time. A wall of the dying building itself between the army and the man who'd been trying to save them. The humming had become something else now. It had become a single low note, all 300 voices on the same tone, and it filled the room and went into your bones, and it did not sound like pain anymore. It sounded like a decision. The soldiers didn't know what to do. You could see it. They were trained for enemies, for fighters, for things that shot back. They were not trained for this, for a wall of unarmed dying people who simply would not get out of the way. Their carbines were up, but their carbines were useless, because what were they going to do? Mow down 300 sick refugees in front of the surveillance nodes Korath himself had installed. Even out on the edge, even at the dump at the end of the maps, there are some things that follow you. Korath knew it too. I watched it land on him. I watched the big certain soldier do a calculation he had never had to do before, because no one had ever stood up to him, because he had never once in his life lost a fight, and here was a fight he could not win without doing a thing that would end him. Move, he told the refugees. His voice had lost its certainty. Move, or I will have you moved. Nobody moved. The old Surith man, the dying one, he was at the front of the wall now, right in front of Korath, this slight blue-green elder looking up at all that armor. And in his humming, faltering voice, in the trade tongue we all shared, he said, "He saved the child. He has been saving us for days while you watched us die. You will not take him." He spread his thin 4-fingered hands. "You will have to kill us first, and there are cameras." And that there are cameras, said by a dying old man who had nothing left, that was the bravest sentence I think I have ever heard. Because it wasn't a threat made from strength. It was a threat made from total weakness, which is the only kind that costs you everything, and he made it anyway. Now I have to tell you the thing that I did, because I was not just a witness that night, and it would be a lie to pretend I was. While the wall of the dying held Korath's attention, while every eye in that room was on the standoff at the front, I moved. Quiet. The way a cargo runner learns to move. I still had Dan's weight a moment before, but Soa had come back through the crowd and taken him, and my hands were free, and I knew this station, remember. I knew it better than almost anyone. I knew where the surveillance feeds ran. I knew where they were stored. And I knew, because I'd bribed a tech once for unrelated reasons, that the holding bay feeds dumped to a single relay node in a junction box not 10 meters from where I stood, behind an access panel I'd opened 100 times to hide cargo. I got the panel open. I found the relay. And I did the only useful thing I have ever done in my long, careful life. I took the recording of the light. The footage of Dan's glowing hands, the footage of the dead child breathing, the footage that proved what he was. I pulled it. All of it. Every copy on that node. And I held it in my hand, this small data core, this thing the whole galaxy would have killed for. And then I had a choice. I could have sold it, understand that. I want you to understand exactly what I was holding. I could have walked off that station and made myself the wealthiest Thren who ever lived. I could have given it to the coalition, or sold it to the corporations, or to a warlord and named my price, any price, and lived 1,000 lifetimes in comfort. The cold part of me, the four-eyed careful part, it knew exactly what it was holding. I crushed it. I put it under my heel and I crushed the data core into powder, right there on the cold floor of the holding bay, and the proof of the most extraordinary thing in the galaxy went out of existence under my foot. I'd like to tell you I did it without hesitation. I hesitated. I am not going to pretend I didn't. I am Thren and we do not get attached, and the hesitation was real. But the child was alive in that crowd, and the man who'd saved her was swaying in Soa's arms, and the old man was standing in front of an army with his hands spread, and I crushed it. Then I stood up and I said, loud across the room to Koreth, "There's no recording, Sub-Marshal." He turned. "Your sensors logged an energy discharge," I said. "That's all you have, an energy discharge from a faulty power cell. I just checked the feed node because I know where it is, and there's no footage of anything else because there was nothing else. A power cell ruptured. A medic collapsed from exhaustion. A room full of sick people got upset when soldiers came in waving guns. That's your incident report, Sub-Marshal. That's all of it. There is nothing here that makes you rich. There is only a story you can't prove, and 300 witnesses who will all swear it was a power cell." I let that sit. "And the cameras that saw your soldiers raise weapons on unarmed refugees." I watched it land. I watched the hunger go out of his eyes and the cold soldier's calculation come back. Without the proof, he had nothing. A wild story about a human who could raise the dead, and not one shred of evidence, and a witness pool of 300 people who would all tell the same lie because they had all just decided to. He'd be a laughingstock. He'd be the sub-marshal who reported a miracle and produced a burned-out power cell. And he'd have on record that he'd nearly massacred a refugee bay over it. There is nothing a certain man fears more than looking like a fool. It took Koreth a long time to decide. The room held its breath the whole while 300 standing refugees, 8 confused soldiers, Soa holding Dan, me standing by a crushed data core. The single low note of the humming never stopped. And then Koreth lowered his head, just slightly, the way a predator does when it decides the prey isn't worth the wound it would cost. He turned to his soldiers. "Stand down," he said. "Power cell malfunction, log it and clear out." The carbines came down. The soldiers, relieved I think though they'd never show it, began to file out. Koreth was the last to go. At the door he stopped and he turned and he looked across the room past the wall of the dying to Dan, hanging in Soa's arms. "I don't know what you are," he said, "but I know what I saw, and I know your friend just buried it. You'll want to be gone from my station by the next cycle, all of you." His eyes moved to me. "Especially you, cargo runner, I'll remember your face." And then he was gone, and the big doors hissed shut, and the cold blue holding bay let out a breath it had been holding for an hour. We left within the cycle, all of us. The Mercy Errant loaded its crew and as many refugees as it could carry, which was nowhere near all of them, but it was the ones in front of us, and you saved the ones in front of you. I helped load them. I used my cargo runner's tricks one last time on Outpost 9, hiding people in spaces meant for crates, getting them past a manifest check. And then I walked away from the only life I'd known, because Koreth would remember my face, and because I found, to my own enormous surprise, that I no longer wanted the life anyway. In came with us. Of course she did. She wouldn't be more than an arm's length from Dan for weeks afterward, the small blue-green shadow of the tired human man, and he never once told her to give him space. He just let her sit beside him, and sometimes she'd put her small four-fingered hand on his, where the light had come from, like she was checking it was still there. Dan slept for almost 2 days after we cleared the system. When he woke, he found me at the viewport of the Mercy Errant, watching the stars instead of a storm for once. He stood beside me a while. Humans do that, stand quiet with you before they say the real thing. "You crushed it," he said finally. "Soa told me, the recording, you could have been rich." "I could have," I agreed. "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. I took my time the way he'd taught me without meaning to, 4 eyes on the stars. "You once told me," I said, "that you save the one in front of you, and then the next one, that it's not complicated, it's just heavy." I looked at him. "The one in front of me was you, so I saved you. It wasn't complicated." I paused. "It was just heavy." He laughed at that, the real laugh this time, not the broken one, and he put a hand on my shoulder. And he said the thing I'd started skimming cargo to hear, all those months ago. "Thank you," he said, all the way down, like I'd done something that mattered. And this time I had. I never learned where the light came from. Dan never learned either, not in all the years I knew him after. It came when he reached the end of everything he could do, when there was nothing left, when the line had been crossed and crossed for good. Sometimes, not always, there was one more thing. He stopped trying to understand it. "So did I. Some things you're not meant to take apart to learn how they work. Some things you're only meant to be grateful for." In grew up. She grew up on the Mercy Errant and then on a green world far from Surith, and she became, of all things, a medic. Of course she did. She'd had a good teacher. The last I heard, years and years on, she was running a clinic on some frontier world not unlike the one she'd been born on, patching up the people the galaxy had given up on, one in front of her and then the next. She never glowed. The light wasn't hers, but she didn't need it. She told me once that the light was never really the point. "The point," she said, in a voice that had lost its humming child tone and gained a woman's certainty, "was that he knelt down. Anybody can have a miracle in their hands. Not everybody kneels down in the mud to use it on a stranger's child. The glow was the easy part, Vel. The kneeling was the hard part." I've thought about that a lot. I think she's right. So that's the strangest thing I ever saw. A tired human man at the end of everything he knew how to do, kneeling in the cold blue light over a child who was already gone. His hands beginning to glow. The wounds vanishing, the breath coming back. But here's what I want to leave you with. Here's the thing I've carried for 40 years, the thing I came all this way to tell you. The glowing hands weren't the miracle. I've decided that after a long life of thinking about it. The light was just light. The galaxy is full of strange powers and stranger things, and if you live long enough you'll see 100 of them, and most of them mean nothing. The miracle was that a man who could have hidden his gift forever, who could have stayed safe and small and unseen, stood up in front of an army with nothing left in his body and said it was me. The miracle was 300 dying strangers standing up off their cots to put themselves between him and the guns. The miracle was an old man with nothing spreading his empty hands and saying, "You'll have to kill us first." The miracle was a cold, careful creature like me, who never got attached to anything, crushing a fortune under his heel for the sake of a friend. The light, you see, came from somewhere I'll never understand. But the kneeling, the standing up, the getting between, the crushing of the fortune, those came from us, from ordinary, frightened, soft, mortal people choosing in the worst hour of the worst night to be brave for someone who wasn't even our own kind. That's the part I'd take apart if I could. That's the part I'd study in a lab in the core, not the glow, the kneeling. Because the glow was rare, and you'll likely never see it. But the kneeling is in all of us, and it's the only miracle that was ever ours to make.